afternoon or good morning, maybe perhaps where some of you are. My name is Kim Beer. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. And it's so wonderful to see so many familiar names log in. So we're so grateful for everyone's dedication and continued support of the foundation and our advocacy programs and priorities. And it's also wonderful to see some new names. So welcome. And of course, any one of us on this webinar can answer any questions either during the webinar itself. I'll be managing the questions in the chat box, or please feel free to contact any one of us after the webinar. We try to do these at least every other month, if not monthly. We have a lot to share with you today. Happy September. We are nearing the end of Spinal Cord Injury Awareness Month. We hope you are all staying safe and well wherever you are. So let's get started. I could talk about who will be part of our panel and our agenda for today. We follow a similar agenda each month, but we will spend a lot of time today talking about what's happening in Congress. You may, and truth be told, I sometimes get confused about the news and updates about what's happening on Capitol Hill. So we look forward to our colleagues sharing some congressional updates. And of course, Chris, many of you who keep in contact with Chris on a daily basis, he'll give us a really robust update on the grassroots front. And of course, we'll manage any questions as we go along. And as I mentioned, please contact us if you need to chat with us, any of us individually. My colleagues from Waxman Strategies, with whom we worked for many years, we're so thrilled with our partnerships. Alicia Lomax and John Sawyer will be presenting on the congressional front. And of course, Chris Carson, our fantastic policy and advocacy coordinator. So I think Celicia is up first. Thank you, Celicia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim, for that introduction. And thanks again to everyone that's able to join us today. As Kim mentioned earlier, for those who might be following what's happening in Congress or not, there's a lot of moving pieces, and I understand that it can be quite overwhelming. So we have essentially broken what's happening in Congress right now, for the most part, into three primary paths here. And the overall goal with these different pieces of legislation and these paths is for the White House and congressional leaders really to pass at this point what looks like the largest and really most sweeping legislation in over a decade. And they're hoping to do that before the end of this calendar year, where there's a lot of major deadlines coming up that we'll talk about shortly. And as I mentioned, again, these are all different moving pieces and interconnected in some ways. So the three paths start with the first on bipartisan infrastructure. Senate Democrats and Republicans have been working on this throughout the course of the summer. And we're looking at now where it has been moving within the House. The second path that we'll talk about is the Build Back Better legislation, or what's been called reconciliation, because it is an effort that is led primarily by Democrats to pass the more social spending, or what they've coined as human infrastructure changes. And the last path here that we'll talk about is along the lines of appropriations and the debt limit, really thinking about where there has been spending for the government as we think about what that expiration will look like in the coming weeks, and wanting to make sure that the government continues to stay funded. So if we go on to the next slide, the first one, again, is the infrastructure package. As I mentioned, Senate Democrats and Republicans worked together and passed a bipartisan infrastructure deal on August 10th, which with a 69-30 vote. And that package is a $1 trillion plan that's really expected to increase federal spending by about $500 billion, which is a really big increase in federal spending. So the House at this moment is really trying to keep up parallel work streams between this infrastructure package and Build Back Better legislation, which we'll get to shortly. There are a number of different challenges there. One piece of this actually is that the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, agreed to a vote on this infrastructure bill next week. So right now, the vote is supposed to be happening next Monday. There is a possibility that it will be pushed back. And part of it come from the fact that there's a number of challenges that sort of lies ahead with this bill and the Build Back Better legislation. And that's in part because of disagreements even within the Democratic Party around what we want to prioritize in these pieces of legislation. And so thinking about progressive Democrats, which you all may have heard of having disagreements with moderate Democrats, and where that kind of falls, especially along those same lines with Republicans who may not want to support any of this, as there have been challenges with this in general. So we will keep watching this. It's supposed to be having some movement next week, and we'll continue to keep our eyes on it. If we go on to the next page, we can see what some of the infrastructure package provision includes. And this is how you sort of think about more of the traditional infrastructure, where there's funding to rebuild roads and bridges, funding for the electric grid and power, as well as investments in broadband, which has been really important as we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as funding for water systems and public transit. And so that's one path. We'll move on to reconciliation and appropriations, and I'll actually pass it over to my colleague, John, to talk a bit more about those.
Great. Thank you so much, Celicia, for that introduction and for that framing. I think it's really important as we're trying to follow what's going on in Congress this fall, which is a lot, probably more moving pieces than at any time I've been here, and that's been about 20 years. I think it just reiterating that I think what we're seeing right now is 3 interconnected paths, potentially 4, and we'll get to that in just a moment, that are the sort of major buckets of legislation Congress is working on, as Celicia laid out. The largest of those is what's now known as the Build Back Better Act or legislation. This legislation is also being referred to as the budget reconciliation legislation. That is a reference to the congressional procedure that they're using in order to try and pass this legislation. Without going into all the detail, budget reconciliation is a route of passing legislation that means that you don't need 60 votes in the Senate, you only need 51. Democrats have those 51 when you consider the vice president's role as a tie-breaking vote. But along with that comes some procedural hurdles and some restrictions on what kinds of things can and can't be in the Build Back Better legislation. So as opposed to the infrastructure bill, which Celicia mentioned, which has bipartisan support and as she mentioned, got even more than 60 votes in the Senate, this legislation is designed to pass with only Democratic votes. This is a process that's been used in past administrations and past Congresses of both parties, most recently in 2017 to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that President Trump was championing. So just wanted to set that stage in terms of how this bill is different than the infrastructure bill, and then how it's different than we'll get to the regular appropriations and the government funding bill. This package, based on the rules that are put in place around its passage, can be up to $3.5 trillion in spending. What that means is that's on the spending side. There are also going to be a number of provisions included in this bill, which we'll talk about, that are considered savings. Those are things, revenue raisers, like increases to specific taxes, as well as a large plan that Democrats in the Congress have to allow Medicare to negotiate the price of prescription drugs, which alone would save somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion over the 10-year window. And I'll also just say the cost would be 3.5 trillion at the most. That is over 10 years. So what we're really talking about here is some $350 billion a year at most. Unlike the packages that passed earlier this year, the rescue plan, that was a $1.9 trillion bill, really all designed to be spent within the next couple of years. So all that being said, there are pretty substantial differences at this point, and not necessarily between Republicans and Democrats, that are slowing this bill down. Again, it's designed to be passed with only Democratic votes. there are actually differences between progressive and moderate Democrats over the size of the bill, the scope of the bill, and sort of which provisions are considered a priority. So let's dive a little deeper into the next slide, and we can talk about what all is in this bill. And this is, I will say, a very Cliff Notes version. This legislation, once it's all coming together, is likely to be several thousand pages of provisions. But some of the top line items that are included in this package: universal paid leave provisions, obviously of major interest to our community, but also to any number of communities across the country. Universal pre-K provisions, childcare subsidies. There are also, there's some discussion of an extension, possibly a permanent extension, of the increased child tax credit that was included in the American Rescue Plan. Another thing that was also included in the rescue plan that the Congress is looking to extend would be more generous subsidies for the Affordable Care Act and those who buy their coverage through the Affordable Care Act. The rescue plan passed provisions that would increase the amount of subsidies that go to individuals and families buying coverage through the ACA. This would attempt to make those subsidies permanent. There are several other health-related provisions in this bill not listed here. There's an effort to expand Medicare benefits to cover vision, hearing, and dental services, something that's been left out of Medicare for quite some time since its founding. There is also our provisions designed to expand Medicaid or provide similar coverage to Medicaid in the 11 states that have not currently expanded Medicaid. And so there's just a number of different healthcare provisions. As we mentioned, most of those are likely to be paid for, if at all, by the Medicare prescription drug provisions also included in the bill. Then the last one of those that I'll mention, and probably where we as your team in Washington and the advocates around the country have been paying the most attention, is included in his proposals for this legislation. President Biden outlined a call for up to $400 billion investment in home and community-based services through Medicaid. This is a program that exists today. It gives states the opportunity to provide services, not in an institutional setting, but to do so in homes, in people's homes and community-based settings, mostly focused on individuals with disabilities and aging populations. So this was a very, very big part of the Biden plan. It's probably one of the largest parts of that plan, and as such, as the overall size and scope of this legislation is negotiated, we'll talk about that in a moment, the potential is that the number there could come down. And, again, I think we've already seen in the House, their call is for about $190 billion in HCBS funding. We're still advocating with the Senate to keep that number as high as possible. But it's now, we're in this situation where lots of good things are competing with each other in these legislation. And while $3.5 trillion over 10 years is quite a lot of money, it's not necessarily enough to fund every priority. So that's something that we're paying close attention to. We have an active action alert on ACBS, and Chris can speak to that in just a moment. So I just want to switch gears to talk about the third sort of path that's moving, because each of these has their own challenges, and then there are challenges about the sequencing of these provisions and how they're all coming together. I do see we have a quick question, and I just want to take a look at that. Safeguards of the funding, actually. There are, I don't know Monica, thank you for this question. The question is, are there any safeguards that the funding actually goes to those providing the services and not to the agencies themselves to make more profits? We all know that personal care assistants are not paid well and have no benefits and job security, and that shortage is a real issue. Thank you for raising that point. I don't have all the details on that, but I do know that there are both, it's not just an open pot of funding. There are provisions in this legislation to make sure that with the HCBS funding specifically, that there are wage protections and wage requirements for individuals providing care. And so I know that this is considered, including by the unions who represent many of those folks. You know, this is a workforce provision as much as anything, as much as a care provision. So I think that concern is very much built into the structure of the legislation, and we can follow up with some more specifics coming out of that. Really, really good question. So just to switch to the last bucket that Congress is working on here, and we have it as both government spending and the debt limit. And when I said earlier, there's 3 paths, but maybe 4, this is the split that we may see coming in the next week or so. So additional, beyond the infrastructure bill, beyond the reconciliation bill, as is true every year, Congress needs to pass appropriations bills in order to fund the government, in order to provide the amount of money that will go to each provision, each program in the federal government, not just each department, but within each department, each agency, within each agency, each program. And that happens every year, and that the deadline for completing that work is September 30th. The new federal fiscal year starts October 1st. If Congress does not complete all the individual appropriations bills line by line by September 30th, there's sort of 2 things that can happen. One is what's called a continuing resolution, and that is essentially basically Congress saying, we're going to put the government on autopilot for a specific period of time. We're going to extend funding at current levels for, in this case, we're expecting them to do this, and we're expecting that to be for a couple of months into early December. If Congress does not come to any agreement whatsoever, even on continuing resolution, that's when we have experienced, as we did in the past few years, a government shutdown. And so any agency for which Congress has not passed their appropriation would potentially have a shutdown, and that affects each agency differently. Typically, they keep essential programs going, essential personnel going, but everywhere from Congress to the national parks to, the Department of Housing and Urban Development to the Defense Department will shut down some element of their operations if Congress is not able to pass that funding bill on time. Now, just for context, the last time the Congress actually passed all 12 separate appropriation bills by September 30th was, I think, something like the late 90s. So typically, they do a continuing resolution to give themselves a bit more time and to address any outstanding issues. That is what we expect this time. The one wrinkle, and it's a very big wrinkle, is that currently the plan that Democrats have outlined is that they will tie government funding, the extension of government funding or the continuing resolution, to an increase in what's called the statutory debt limit. And this, while sounding very wonky and actually being very wonky, is really, really important. Congress has put in the law a hard limit on how much debt the nation can accumulate before defaulting on its debt. And this is not about new spending. This is about spending that has been put out over time. And as government revenues come in and as government spending goes out, the overall debt that the government undertakes continues to grow. If it exceeds that statutory debt limit without an increase to that debt limit, very bad things can happen. So basically, either they can make some hard choices about stopping payments on things like Social Security and Medicare and other major payments that would need to go out, or the country can essentially default on its debt. That has never happened, and there's a lot of speculation that were that allowed to happen, we would see major chaos in global financial markets and economic stability around the world. So Not a small matter. That debt limit is expected to be hit sometime in October. It's not the kind of thing, unlike a statutory deadline, where there's a specific date. It has to do with how much is coming in and how much is going out. So the Democrats have proposed tying an increase in the debt limit or a suspension of the debt limit for the time being to the continuing resolution. Republicans, especially in the Senate, have said that they will not support an increase in the debt limit this year, and that Democrats are in charge and need to do this on their own. Unfortunately, you need 60 votes in the Senate to do this standalone, and so Republicans are essentially asking the Democrats to tie a debt limit increase to the second bucket, to the reconciliation bill that we already talked about. So this is, again, another one of these moving pieces going on in Washington right now. I will say, just as context, I think it's important for advocates to have a real sense of all the different moving pieces. It is not your job, it is not even our job to figure out how they resolve all of these pieces. It is our job here on your team, Celicia, Kim, Chris, and myself, to understand how all these pieces are moving and to be able to answer questions for you. But at this point, these are decisions, really being made by the leadership of both parties in the Senate, by the leadership of both parties in the House, and by the White House and by the president. So it's a very small group of people trying to manage a whole lot of different moving pieces. And in the case of the Democrats, get all the different factions of their party on board for that strategy. And obviously, time is short here. Celicia mentioned that the scheduled vote on the infrastructure bill is on Monday. We expect that to go ahead, whether it has the votes to pass in the House or not, without a similar commitment on the other pieces, we don't know. But all of these pieces are sort of moving in parallel and moving in concert. And Chris, we can keep going to the next slide. So we want to zoom way down in now and talk about, within that last piece, within the congressional appropriations that happen every year, one of those thousands of programs that these bills set a funding level for is the Paralysis Resource Center. And as folks, I think, probably all know, the Paralysis Resource Center is a federal program, a federal cooperative agreement or grant that goes to the Reeve Foundation. The foundation, we announced, I think, on our last webinar, recently was re-awarded that grant after a competitive process, and will have that grant for the next 5 years. But that is contingent on Congress actually providing those funds in each of the next 5 years. And that starts with this coming year. So for fiscal year 22, the coming fiscal year, the process is underway. And that's that same process that will need to be continued on September 30th. The House has finalized and passed their appropriations bills. And in that bill, they included, as you can see here, just over $10 million in funding for the PRC, which is a 5% increase. This is the same increase that was called for in the Biden budget proposal. This is really good news. Will allow the PRC to really strengthen and expand some of the work that it's doing. So we are very heartened by that. In the Senate, they have yet to take up that bill. This is in part because of the disputes over all the other issues. And we'll need to have their action in order for this to finish. What we expect the Senate to do is probably not to pass their legislation before the deadline next week, but we expect them potentially to post that legislation on the committee website so that they have basically laid down a marker for where the Senate will be when it comes to final negotiations between the Senate and the House. Again, we expect that to be finalized probably sometime in December, assuming they can get a continuing resolution passed here next week. So we will continue to monitor this. We'll pay very close attention. We feel good about the direction that the Congress is going, specific to PRC funding, obviously following a lot of other issues as well, including the HCBS funding that we mentioned, but always want to give this crew an update on where things stand with the PRC. So just to go over this again, because we've sort of said these things, but it's worth sort of laying this out. Just to go back a little bit in time. So in August, the Senate passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, 69-30. The House and Senate have been spending most of September drafting text for the reconciliation legislation, or the Build Back Better legislation. As part of the negotiations on passage of all of this, the House has committed to a planned vote on the infrastructure bill on Monday. Next Thursday is the date that government funding expires. And, you know, basically we left it as TBD beyond that date, because there are so many open questions as to what could happen here, even in the next few days, in terms of the path forward. This is a very, very complicated set of things that the leadership folks are juggling, and we'll see where things go. The one thing I think we can feel pretty certain about is that we do not think all three buckets are going to be wrapped up by next week, and that likely we are headed into, you know, later into December for Congress to hopefully wrap up most of these things. But again, our job is to make sure that you all are informed about what's going on, that we're activating the grassroots network at the right time with the right ask to really make a difference. And we just wanted to make sure that we were sort of explaining that context so that when you get questions or you have questions, you can kind of slot those in as necessary. So I think that's our last slide, and I will turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit more about how all that grassroots pieces are working.
Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Carson, the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator here at the Reeve Foundation. As always, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for all of your efforts over this busy summer in advocating for our various legislative priorities. Before I get into what we're going to be advocating for, what we expect to advocate for, you know, in the near future and later into the winter, I want to take a moment and just review some of the things that have happened over the summer. And, you know, hopefully that will give you a sense of the effectiveness of our advocacy efforts. And then we'll go into what we expect in the fall. So first up, I can get my computer to work again. I wanted to talk about the total and permanent disability discharge, which was an announcement that was made by the Department of Education in August when they announced some major reforms to this program. So to those who may not know, the total and permanent disability discharge, or TPD discharge, is a program that was established by the Higher Education Act of 1965 to allow student loan borrowers who have developed or have had a major disability that prevents them from getting gainful employment to have their student loans discharged or completely forgiven. And on early August, Ed announced that they're going to automatically discharge the loans of hundreds of thousands of borrowers, you know, to the equal of about $500 billion in debt. And then they're also going to begin the process of automatic enrollment through a data match program that they have with the Social Security Administration. And this is a program that they had with the VA for years, but now they're going to also apply to the Social Security Administration. So if a person is receiving supplemental security income benefits or Social Security disability insurance, that data match will ensure that that person is automatically enrolled into the TPD discharge program automatically. So you don't have to fill out paperwork, or if you're in these programs, you don't need to get the physician's letter, you know, stating that you're a person living with a total or permanent disability. Although you still have that option if someone does not fall into the category of the VA receiving SSI or SSD beneficiaries, they can still get a physician's letter. But Ed just wants to make the process easier for some student loan borrowers to get them into the program. And they're also, for a short period of time, removing the financial monitoring period. And this was great news for us because in April, Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, we signed on to a letter that was spearheaded by our coalition partners at the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, CCD, asking the Department of Ed to make these changes. And we even joined a meeting with our partners at CCD, with staff from the Department of Education to talk about this. And we were very pleased to get that announcement. And we know that next month, and starting in October, Ed is going to, the Department of Education will explore permanently eliminating that financial monitoring period. And we actually just got word that one of our fellow members of the CCD Education Task Force is going to be involved in those talks representing individuals with disabilities. And we expect that there might be sometime in the near future an opportunity for public comment. So we'll continue to let you know about that. And in the meantime, if you have any more questions about this program, you know, if you qualify or what some of the details are of these changes, please feel free to reach out to me. And we also have, we've written a blog explaining some of these changes, which we expect to have published on our website soon. So to be on the lookout for more information there. Another update that I wanted to give you is around the Air Carriers Access Amendment Act. So some of you who are joining us today, you may remember on our last webinar in July, we were joined by Heather Ansley from Paralyzed Veterans of America to talk about the Air Carriers Access Amendment Act. And here's where we are now. In June, we sent out, or earlier in the summer, it might have been June, might have been early July, actually, excuse me. We put out an action alert, which was really, really successful. We had sent 894 letters to the House of Representatives urging members to co-sponsor HR 1696, which was drafted by Congressman Jim Langevin's office. And we were pleased to learn that that action alert and that advocacy efforts from all of you actually helped to secure 8 new co-sponsors for that bill. So the goal going forward is just to keep up the momentum and to try to get as many co-sponsors as possible on that bill, because the Senate has signaled that they are not going to be taking up this issue of accessible air travel until they begin working on the next Federal Aviation Authority authorization bill, which is going to come next year. So between now and 2022, when they begin working on FAA authorization, we just want to continue to get co-sponsors on that bill to keep up the momentum and really have a good showing for the Senate that there's a lot of support for this legislation in the House. The other thing that is upcoming around Air Carriers Access Amendment Act is the 35th anniversary of the signing of the original Air Carriers Access Act is coming up soon, and working again with our friends at Paralyzed Veterans of America, they're going to put out a travel survey, which we will be sure to distribute to everyone here and all of our regional champions so that you can weigh in on your experience with air travel. Just again, so that when it comes time next year, when the Senate and the House take up the FAA authorization, we'll have stories from folks about the experience of air travel. We'll have lots of co-sponsors on HR 1696 and really try to get in the best position possible to have this important bill included in that FAA authorization. Now, looking to the near future, and as John mentioned, early into the fall and the winter, what are our legislative priorities? So again, garnering support for home and community-based services and the BCBJA, Better Care, Better Jobs Act, is going to be a big priority for us. I know particularly around the issue of home care is really a huge issue right now. I was in Phoenix earlier this month and, meeting with folks in the community at the Abilities Expo, heard a lot of stories from people about the struggles to find home health care. I know even in my own family, before my grandfather passed away last month, my mother and my grandmother were really turning themselves inside out, just trying to find someone who would be able to come to the house and help care for my grandfather even one day a week. So this legislation, the investment in home and community-based services, we expect to be a way to sort of to plug that hole and to get people who need these home care benefits, the help that they need. We put out an action alert earlier this month, which has gotten some good results. We sent 925 emails to Congress in support of including the $400 billion of funding for home and community-based services, and ensuring some of the benefits laid out in the Better Care and Better Jobs Act would be included in this reconciliation bill. And as John noted, there's still much to be settled in all of this, so there's still lots of time for us to weigh in. This is one issue that I know input from the community and for members hearing from their constituents and members hearing from people who rely on these services. They really need that. So that action alert is still live. I encourage everyone, if you haven't taken action yet, to do so, to share it with your network, and reach out to me as we continue to contact offices and ask for meetings and let Congress know how important these investments would be. Please reach out to me. We have a state sheet that outlines how a major investment in home and community-based services will impact each state. And it's just really important that we get in front of members of Congress and their staff and let them know that this is a vitally important program, which I know is even outlined. There's an article in the New York Times today talking about how important this would be and how Americans with disabilities should not be left out of this major piece of legislation. So please reach out to me if you want some more info on our materials around HCBS funding. And finally, we have the issue of complex rehab technology, which I know is one that is important to so many people who are on this call and who are advocates and everyone in the community. Earlier this week, our friends at NCART, the National Coalition for Assistive and Rehab Technology, they held a virtual fly-in where they brought individuals with disabilities and folks who work in the industry together, and they scheduled more than 200 meetings with congressional staff. And one of their asks was to get members to sign on to a letter that has been co-sponsored again by Congressman Jim Langevin, and this time Congressman Don Young, the Republican from Alaska, a letter to go to CMS Administrator Chiquita Brooks-LaShore about moving forward on a stalled coverage request for standing feature power seat elevation. As many of you know, Medicare currently does not cover the funding for power seat elevation and power standing systems with CRT. And last year, I think it was September maybe of 2020, advocates submitted a formal request for reconsideration of that existing national coverage determination for mobility assistive equipment. And CMS has still not opened that request for essential public comment. So the Langevin and Young letter is urging them to move on this. So watch out for your inbox. We're working on another action alert asking representatives to sign on to this Langevin and Young letter to CMS. And that should be out, we're hoping early next week. So please be on the lookout for that. I know that access to CRT and these features on wheelchairs is vitally important to so many people. And, we're encouraged to see that Congress is starting to take notice and to get involved. So we see this as a really great opportunity for us to weigh in and to hopefully make some movement on that. So next steps through the fall and the winter, our priorities, we really wanted to really touch on the HCBS investment in the reconciliation bill. Make that a priority in any meetings that you have with members and their staff between now and the end of the year. I'm going to share the ACAA survey that should be out soon. And again, along with the NCART issue, it's not included here on our priorities, but as I mentioned, the action alert around CRT should be out next week. As always, continue to schedule meetings with representatives and senators. continue to reach out for me for our advocacy toolkit. It seems like, we're adding new material to that on a regular basis. So just a reflection of lots of things going on Capitol Hill, lots of areas for us to weigh in, study and review that toolkit, and then prepare to go into meetings and tell your stories about how all of these issues will impact you. So that's our grassroots advocacy update. And now I will turn it back over to Kim to talk about a couple of upcoming events that we have with the Reeve Foundation.
Thank you so much, Chris and John and Celicia. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some really important events that I'm sure if you've been following our social media, you're seeing our promoting of our second annual Reeve Run and Roll, which will be happening starting September 25th through October 3rd. And we're thrilled that we're have a growing team virtually again this year, participants of any athletic and all athletic abilities. Please join us to run, roll, cycle, swim, surf, dribble, walk, and so much more. Whatever you'd like to do over the course of a week. We're trying our best to make sure that individuals upload their social media, their pictures as they participate in this event, and to keep us all connected on one of our major fundraising efforts for the year. And this is a really personal matter for me and for the foundation, as in that picture, believe it or not, in 2018, I was able to complete the New York City Marathon. It was an extraordinary experience, and I was able to raise funds for the foundation, which was fantastic. But that man with me is Mark Zenobia, who has, in the photo, who has dedicated many, many years to the foundation, getting many, many athletes over the finish line, including myself. And I'm sure many athletes tell him, if I can do it, anyone can do it. And so all abilities participate in all of our Team Reeve events. Mark Zenobia, we're honoring him this annual Reeve Run and Roll. He is currently navigating the diagnosis of ALS, and we love and support and just think the world of him. And he is continuing to train and support athletes this fundraising season for all our Team Reeve events. So if you're so inclined, we'd love to have you join us virtually for our Reeve Run and Roll. It's free to join. If you'd like a t-shirt, you can raise $35. Again, in support of our really beloved team, Reeve coach Mark. That would be wonderful. And then the second upcoming event, if you follow our blogs, one of our newer advocates and community members with whom the foundation has recently connected this year, a wonderful woman named Tyra Randall, who participated in our annual summit earlier this year. She participated in a panel discussion around surviving a violent act against her, and as a result, she sustained a spinal cord injury. And she really shared really personal and vulnerable her experience as someone living with a spinal cord injury now. And if you follow our blog post, she recently just posted a blog about her experience in honor of Spinal Cord Injury Awareness Month. And so I wanted to highlight and flag that for you. And I also wanted to flag an upcoming panel that she will be participating with other advocates reflecting on their journey and their perspectives and knowledge they now have versus when they first were injured. So we'll make sure we send that. I think it's in the chat box. And I just wanted to highlight that important event too, that will close out Spinal Cord Injury Awareness Month. So thank you so much. And let me check that. I don't think we have any additional questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write it in the Q&A or the chat. We will send this recording around. We're so grateful for everyone's participation. I don't know if the panel has any additional thoughts. I'm going to close it out.
No, I think those are great notes to end on. Really excited for those upcoming events, and yeah, thanks to everybody for joining.
Great. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Stay well.